Hello everyone, I thought I would make a quick tip video for Battle Aces and making your first deck. So this is going to be going over some general tips and hopefully won't go into too many of the specifics as they're probably going to change over the course of the beta, but yeah, hopefully these will be general enough so that you will be able to use them in future versions of the game. We are going to be using a website called crablab.gg. It is a website that was created by somebody in the community, and I will link this website in the video description. It's a great resource in order to create a deck and see or just plan something out, since all of the units that you're going to be able to get require a resource or a currency in order to unlock. And we will get started just describing each of the different unit slots to start out with. On the very far left column is going to be your core units. These are going to be your tier 1 units that are going to be available at the beginning of the game. Next, we are going to be changing it up and going for the different rows, as the top row is going to be your foundry units. So this is going to be your tier 2 foundry unit, this is going to be your tier 3 foundry unit, and this is going to be your tier 2 or tier 3 foundry unit. It's going to be a wildcard slot. I like to call it your flex spot because it can be either tier 2 or tier 3. Something to note about the foundry is that they're all going to be ground units, so something to keep in mind: if you press your spacebar, you're going to be able to see your opponent's deck, and you will also be able to see which way they are teching in their tech tree, so you know if they're going to be taking into the foundry, they're going to be only allowed to build ground only units. Again, this might be subject to change, but at the moment, this is how it is. Next, going into the bottom row, these are going to be your Starforge units, and these are going to, or this slot is going to be your tier 2 Starforge, this is going to be the tier 3 Starforge, and this is going to be, again, the wildcard Starforge, which is going to be either tier 2 or tier 3. Something to note about the Starforge is that they can be both ground and air units, so you really want to pay attention when your opponent is going for a Starforge tech, because dealing with the different units that they have is going to be a little bit more complicated. Okie doke. Next, we are going to be going into this beautiful diagram that David Kim provided on the Reddit. And this is just the square of counters. So the small units are great at dealing with the anti-big units. The anti-big are kind of like anti-tank type units. These units are obviously great against the big units or the tanky type units, and the big type units are great against the splash units. And the splash units are obviously going to be good against the small units. The small units are going to be things like your tier 1 units, and also some tier 2 and tier 3 units that are just they clump up a little bit more, and they're a little bit smaller on your screen as well. And the anti-big units are going to be things like a destroyer or an advanced recall, but these are also going to be subject to change. The big units or the tanks are going to be things like a Crusader or a Behemoth, and a splash, for example, is going to be a Mortar or a Shocker, something like that. And those, you just want to have a more a diverse deck so you can always be able to deal with some of the threats that your opponent has. So, for example, one thing that I saw in the beta that was quite common is somebody would go for a destroyer and also a mortar for their tier 2 foundry units, and by doing so, it would allow them to have both the AoE from the mortar and also the anti-tank from the destroyer. So if your opponent went for something like Crusader in their deck, you would be able to deal with those with the destroyer and prevent the Crusaders from getting on top of your mortars and protecting them and allowing them to do all the AoE that you would like for them to do. Going back into the core units is there were two different types of combinations that I saw throughout the beta. One is going to be the anti-ground only units, which is going to be something like a crab and a recall, or probably something more like a wasp and a recall. So the idea behind something like this is that the Wasp and the Recall serve drastically different roles within the game. The Wasp is extremely fast, it doesn't cost a lot of resources, and it is great for things like counterattacking and scouting. But the Recall is great at defending, and it is also great in including into an army to attack your opponent with, because the recalls are fairly tanky and they're one of the highest DPS units for the tier 1 slot. And the obvious counter or our counter to this, or sorry, the downside to something like this is going to be that you obviously don't have any anti-air units in your deck. So if your opponent attacks into the Starfort units, you want to be careful and you want to make sure that you have a way to deal with your opponent's air threats. And last thing I wanted to go over in this video is something that I saw in the beta. A lot of the times the opponents and players that I go against would have 2 tier 2 units, so something like a king crab and maybe a mortar or something, and then they would have only 1 tier 3 unit like an advanced blink or something like that. And I think the main reason I saw something like this quite often was because a lot of the games end in the mid game when you're after you tech up one time, and the diversity that you get with these 2 tier 2 units is very valuable and can allow you to punish your opponent and attack your opponent right away. But the obvious downside is that if your opponent has 2 tier 3 units, that you won't be able to scale as well as them, and you won't be as effective in the straight up fights, so you're probably going to need to rely more on counterattacks and things like that. So something to keep in mind when you are going up against an opponent with dual tier 3 is that you probably want to end the game a little bit earlier, just so you don't get outvalued by them. And I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to go over. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. And also, if you have any other general tips that you want to share to some players that are coming into the game, please leave them in the comments as well. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys next time.